Powerlifting is one of the most confusing sports out there with so many different categories and divisions. You have raw, you have equipped, you have tested, you have untested, and it doesn't help when a lot of people compare lifters from across these categories without quite fully understanding them. What also doesn't help is that there's no one consolidated source of information that describes this accurately. Until now. If powerlifting confuses you, you're in the right place because I'm about to explain it super simply in just a few minutes. So we have two broad categories in powerlifting. We have raw and equipped. Each one of those has a further two categories, classic raw and raw with wraps, and Singleply and multiply. Let's go through what each one of these mean. So on the classic raw side, you have a belt, knee sleeves, and wrist wraps. Do these actively add kilos to your total and allow you to lift more weight? No, it's more of a comfort / supportive / confidence thing. Raw with wraps is the same, however, we're replacing knee sleeves with knee wraps on squats. Now, knee wraps aid in knee extension a lot more than knee sleeves do, and they add a lot more kilos to your squats. Some lifters get upwards of 10+% extra on their squats with wraps. Onto the equipped side, so Singleply takes the raw with wraps setup, but adds the use of lifting suits or equipment or gear, whatever you want to call them, in the form of a squat suit, a bench shirt, and a deadlift suit. Now these are very supportive suits made up of very stretchy material, usually a single layer of polyester, hence the name Singleply, that add a lot of kilos to your lifts, particularly on the squat and on the bench, slightly less so on the deadlift. Multiply is effectively the same thing, except the suits are a lot thicker, a lot more supportive, and they add a lot more kilos to your lifts. They're usually made up of multiple layers of polyester, canvas, nylon, even elastic sometimes, hence the name Multiply. And with this, it is usually the case that lifters are going to be benching more than what they deadlift. Now, powerlifting is one of the rare sports, potentially one of the only sports, that has an open, untested side to it, where lifters are free to use whatever substances they like to lift the most amount of weight. Now, out of these four categories, raw with wraps and multiply are entirely untested, meaning there are no tested federations if you want to compete in those two categories. Not any reputable ones anyway. Now, does that mean you have to be using certain substances to compete there? No, it just means that you can't guarantee that everyone you compete against will be doing the same. Classic raw and Singleply have a tested and an untested side, however. So on the tested side, the main governing body is the IPF, the International Powerlifting Federation, and also the USAPL is the only other one worth mentioning, which split off from the IPF from 2022 onwards. But all the best lifters in the world, almost all of them are in the IPF, but all of them are either IPF or USAPL. There's a few other federations that no one cares about. On the untested side, there are about 50,000 different federations. Probably the two most popular ones have been the USPA and the WRPF that you might have heard of, but there's no one central governing body like there is on the tested side with the IPF. Now, speaking of the IPF first held its world championships back in 1973. However, back then, there was no such thing as raw lifting, it was all Singleply. So from 1973 all the way till 2012, the World Championships were only Singleply, and it was only from 2012 onwards that they introduced a raw division. And this is what I refer to as classic modern raw tested powerlifting, which you'll probably hear that phrase in the channel quite a bit. Now, it's true that in the early days, the lifting equipment wasn't anywhere near as supportive as what it is today. But we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, now let's go through each one of these and talk about who you might have heard of and where they fit into this. So Multiply peaked around the 2000s, and popular lifters you may have heard of, Mark Bell. So Mark Bell from Super Training Gym had some great gym videos and tutorials back in the day. Also sold some pretty cool merch. So stuff like the strong sleeves and strong wraps, the slingshot benches, which he actually modeled off of Multiply bench shirts. Westside Barbell, if you've ever heard of that or seen the documentary Westside versus the World, that was all about Multiply lifting. All those guys there were Multiply lifters. Louis Simmons, the founder and owner of Westside Barbell, was a Multiply lifter and coach. The conjugate method came from Multiply lifting. Okay, so that's where that kind of fits in. Now, multiply lifting is pretty dead. It is very dead. I personally do not care about multiply lifting, and you're not going to see any multiply content on my channel beyond what I'm about to show you now, which is why multiply lifting is dead. On the left, you have Dave Hoff, who I believe is the all-time world record holder in multiply, squatting somewhere north of 550 kilos, and that is indeed the lowest position he got in that squat, and he got white lighted for it. On the right, you have Scott Mendelson benching over 1,000 pounds and struggling to get the bar to touch his chest. That's the lowest he managed to get that bar. After that, the bar drifted out in front of him towards his feet, and the spotters had to save him. Now, if you can't even touch your chest with 1,000 pounds on a bench press, what does that say about the sort of equipment that you're using? So yeah, those two photos I think perfectly sum up why multiply lifting is dead. If you're a fan of multiply or you're a multiply lifter yourself, hey, I'm not judging, all power to you, but for me, just not of interest. Okay, Singleply. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the Singleply untested side because I quite frankly do not care and not many people do. Singleply tested side, this is, like I said, what the IPF was from 1973 up until 2012 exclusively. Singleply is still a category in the IPF. It's nowhere near as popular as Raw is. But lifters you may have heard of from this category are Ed Coan, who is commonly quoted as being the powerlifting GOAT, which he's not, and I'll explain why. Yaroslav Olek, who is like a 20-time world champion. Lamar Gant, who deadlifted like 300 plus, weighing around 60 back in the day, which is crazy. And also a lot of high-level strongmen who are said to have powerlifting backgrounds in those early strongman competitions. This is where they fit in. So guys like Bill Kazmaier, there was a bunch of other ones. Big Z as well back in the day, competed in tested powerlifting in the IPF in Singleply. So on the left there you have Ed Coan with his 900-pound deadlift. On the right you have Yaroslav Olek with a 370-kilogram squat in the 74-kilo weight class. Now, why is Ed Coan not the GOAT? First of all, very impressive lifter, crazy numbers. But people are comparing his numbers to those lifters of today on the Raw side, and that it simply shouldn't be happening. He was a Singleply lifter. He lifted equipped, not Raw. Now, I know we're going to be saying back in the day, the equipment wasn't anywhere near as much as what it is today. That is true. In fact, back in the early days of Singleply, even in Ed Coan's era in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't uncommon for lifters to be benching and deadlifting Raw and only squatting with an early primitive version of a squat suit and primitive knee wraps. And indeed, Ed Coan did bench and deadlift Raw and just squatted equipped. So you might be thinking, well, we can compare him with the Raw guys of today. Well, okay, fair enough. I'll give you that. I'll give you the fact that the equipment back then is nowhere near as supportive as what it is today. You know what else wasn't anywhere near as developed as what it is today, though? The testing. On the left is multiple-time IPF world champion Kirk Kowalski. Now, Kirk was about 5 foot 8 inches tall. He lifted in the 110 kilogram weight class and the 125 kilogram weight class. Now, I don't believe he ever failed a test in his career, but I mean, come on. On the right, Ed Coan, the GOAT as people like to refer to him as, failed not 1, not 2, but 3 tests in his IPF career, and so much so that he received a lifetime doping ban from the IPF. So if you're going to compare him to lifters of today, it'll be the untested side, not the tested side. Okay, onto the untested side. So you have the Raw with wraps and the untested side of classic Raw. Lifters that fit in that you've probably heard of. You have guys like Larry Wheels, was super popular a few years ago. John Hack, Eric Lillibridge. There's a bunch of names I could throw out here. Jamal Browner also fits into here. Now, unlike Singleply and Multiply, which I do not care about pretty much at all, I actually do kind of care about this, because untested lifting peaked in popularity around the 2010s, and it was almost more popular than the tested Raw side around that time. Now it's tanked quite a bit, and there's a lot of things wrong with the untested side, which I'll talk about more in future videos. but I do still kind of care about it, and you will see some content on the untested side on my channel. So there's Eric Lillibridge on the left, squatting about 1,000 pounds, raw with wraps, and there's Larry Wills on the right, deadlifting about 400 kilos. Now, classic raw, the tested side. So this is where the IPF fits in. Modern raw tested powerlifting started in 2012 when the IPF went raw. Guys like Ross Lohi, Jesus Alvarez, Austin Perkins, popular ones that you've probably heard of that fit into this category, the best lifters of today. And this is what powerlifting is, essentially, for the majority of people, right? This is far and away the most popular category. And this is what the majority of people, including myself, care about. And this is where the true sport aspect of powerlifting is. So there you go. You have Jesus, you have Russ. Some great photos there from their most recent World Championships. And like I said, this is what I focus on predominantly in my channel. I care about the IPF and the USAPL side of this. Again, because the other federations, why would I care? And like all the best lifters are in one of these two, and predominantly in the IPF as well. Now, there's one last thing I want to address, which is the fact that some untested federations claim to hold tested divisions within them, and there are some tested lifters who compete there and compare their numbers to the IPF. I want to talk about why I don't consider them in the same category, even though they are still natural lifters. So let's go through the difference between tested and untested meets, because it's more than just the obvious. So like I said, obviously tested, you have to pass a test at the end. Untested, you're free to take whatever substances you want. However, there are three other key differences here. Tested, you have 2-hour weigh-ins. Untested, you have 24-hour weigh-ins. So you can afford to cut a lot more weight. You have a lot more of a rehydration period, right? So lifters in certain weight classes actually can be bigger than what the weight class threshold is. Whereas on the tested IPF side, 2-hour weigh-ins leave you very little room to rehydrate, so you can't cut too much weight. On the tested side, IPF, you have a stiff bar. On the untested side, you have a deadlift bar. More on that in a second. IPF, you have very high standards, the highest of standards. You have an IPF jury that are constantly reviewing every 2-to-1 call to either overturn it to a good lift or a no lift. On the untested side, a lot less consistent standards. There have been some notoriously dodgy calls on squat depth, bench pauses, deadlift lockouts that we've seen, even world record level lifts that a lot of people look at and go, yeah, that shouldn't have passed. So on the deadlift bar, a few years ago, the untested federations introduced the Kabuki deadlift bar, which is a bar that was longer, potentially thinner, a lot more bendy than a stiff bar and even previous deadlift bars. And you can see there, Dan Grigsby with over 1,000 pounds. Yes, it's over 1,000 pounds, but look how much flex is in that bar. And look, I am not a sumo hater at all. I'm far from it. And if you look at sumo lifts on the IPF side with the stiff bar, absolutely no issue with it. But even me, I look at lifts like this and I think to myself, really? And the untested federations recently announced that they were banning the Kabuki deadlift bar, which I think is a good decision. They should never have introduced it in the first place, but they're banning it. And they're going back to the Texas deadlift bar, which is the traditional deadlift bar that's been used. Now, I'm not a fan of this either. It's not as bad as the Kabuki, but it's still pretty bendy, as you can see there. Now, this was something I mentioned in my previous video about Krzysztof Wierzbicki and his deadlift record. This is Khalil Zaki, who deadlifted 402.5 at a bodyweight of 105 last year. Now, Krzysztof Wierzbicki's world record in the 105s is 400 kilos. So if you look on Open Powerlifting, Khalil Zaki holds this record. There's a photo of it there. Compare that to Krzysztof Wierzbicki's 400 that he did back in 2017. Looks like that. Look at the bend in that bar. It's essentially non-existent. 400 kilos, and that stiff bar is stiff as all hell compared to Khalil Zaki's 402.5 that look like that. So to me, that is why lifters that compete in untested federations in the tested divisions cannot claim to be in the same category as the IPF lifters, right? Due to not just the deadlift bar and stiff bar, but also there's other three differences that I mentioned in the previous slides. So that claim, yeah, I don't care. So raw tested powerlifting is where it's at. That's the sport aspect of powerlifting. That's where there's championships. That's where there's titles. That's where there's rivalries, upsets, clashes, battles, everything. That is what makes powerlifting a sport, and that's what's taken off the popularity of powerlifting. IPF is king. That's where all the best lifters are, and that is what my channel predominantly focuses on. Hope this cleared it up, and let me know what you think.